The sun rose slow and heavy over Sierra Verde, a small desert town tucked deep in southern New Mexico. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines, just a handful of adobe houses baked the color of clay, a diner that opened before dawn, and streets that shimmered with heat long before noon. The locals were used to silence, the kind that hummed in the distance. Cicadas whined through dry mesquite, the faint buzz of power lines running along La Paz Avenue. But that morning something gentler broke the quiet. It was the sound of paws, steady and deliberate, tapping against the cracked sidewalk. They belonged to Shadow, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a faded black and tan coat and eyes like pale glass. He was blind, had been for years, but those who knew him never saw disability in that cloudy gaze. They saw history, service, and survival. Shadow once wore a Marine vest in a place far from Sierra Verde, a place of dust and danger called Kandahar. He'd served beside Captain Luke Briggs, a man whose voice he'd memorized through sandstorms and gunfire. Together they had found bombs before they found men, saved lives before dawn, and lived by instinct long after fear should have taken over. Then came the blast, the heat, the roar, and the white that erased everything. Luke didn't make it out. Shadow did, but the light was gone. The explosion severed nerves behind his eyes and left him in permanent darkness. When Shadow was retired, the military called it medical discharge with honors. But for him, life had simply changed missions. That's when Eleanor Briggs, Luke's widow, came for him. People in town called her Ellie, a tall woman of 56 with iron gray hair cut short like she'd never quite left the service. Her husband's death had hollowed her quiet, but her posture still carried command. She'd spent months writing letters, signing forms, refusing to let Shadow be sent to a kennel. She wanted to bring him home not because she needed a dog, but because she needed what was left of Luke. Ellie and Shadow settled into a rhythm on the edge of town. Her small adobe house sat behind a low wooden fence, half buried in tumbleweed. Every morning she boiled water for chamomile tea and read the paper aloud, half for herself, half for him. When she spoke, Shadow tilted his head as if listening to a briefing he'd once been part of. On Tuesdays, they walked to the community center where local kids took turns reading stories to Shadow. The program was called Read to a Hero. Most of the children didn't fully understand why the dog couldn't see, but they knew he had been a soldier, and that was enough. Among them was Emma Valdez, a bright-eyed 9-year-old who carried a book wherever she went. She would sit cross-legged on the rug, reading softly, her small hand resting on Shadow's back. He'd stay perfectly still, breathing slow, listening not to the words but to the kindness in her voice. Every few weeks, Marcus Reed dropped by. He was 46 now, a mechanic who lived out of an old garage near the highway. Most folks in town knew him as the quiet man with too many scars and too few smiles. But to Ellie, he was more a reminder of the unit that never came home whole. Marcus had once served under Captain Luke Briggs in the same K-9 division. He owed his life to Luke and Shadow. They'd dragged him out of the wreckage the night the convoy went up in flames. When he looked at the dog, he didn't just see fur and age, he saw a promise. He kept Luke's old Marine pin on a chain around his neck and rarely spoke of the war. Yet every time he saw Shadow, he saluted quietly before kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ear. "Still on duty, huh?" he'd murmur, and somehow Shadow's tail would thump twice as if answering always. That Monday evening was warm and still. The sky burned red above the desert ridge, and Ellie felt a faint tightness in her chest as she washed the dishes. She brushed it off, just fatigue, she told herself. Shadow lay nearby, nose twitching at the scent of dinner cooling on the counter. Before bed, Ellie knelt beside him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Good night, soldier," she whispered. He leaned into her palm, breathing slow and steady. Outside, Sierra Verde slept beneath a sky full of indifferent stars. No one knew that by sunrise one act of fear and misunderstanding would shake the town and the nation to its knees, not through violence but through shame, and eventually through light. The next morning came too soon. By 7:00 a.m., the desert sun was already a hammer against the pale streets of Sierra Verde. The air shimmered over cracked asphalt, and the smell of dust mixed with the faint sweetness of blooming creosote. Inside the small adobe house on the corner of Alamosa Street, Eleanor Briggs sat at her kitchen table, a mug of chamomile trembling slightly in her hand. Her head throbbed. She'd been fighting a fever since the night before, the kind that makes light feel sharp and the air too heavy. She reached for her medicine cabinet but stopped halfway, her vision blurred and her arm felt weak. From the corner of the room, Shadow lifted his head. He didn't need to see her. He could hear the change in her breathing, the soft, uneven rhythm that meant something wasn't right. He rose quietly, his old paws clicking on the tile floor. He nudged her knee once, then again. Ellie smiled faintly, running her hand along his neck. "I'm okay, soldier. Just tired." But Shadow knew better. For years that voice had been his compass, calm, steady, unwavering. Now it was thin and trembling. She leaned back, eyes closed. The tea mug slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a soft crack. The sound made Shadow jerk his head toward it. He sniffed the air once more, then looked toward the front door, ears flicking. He could smell the faint trace of orange blossoms drifting from the direction of the community center, 3 blocks away, the place they went every Tuesday. And Tuesday was today. Shadow hesitated by the door. He had never gone far without Ellie. She always guided him with soft words. Left shadow. Stop. Forward. But something inside him stirred, the same instinct that had carried him through battlefields and explosions. A voice older than obedience whispered, "Mission first." He pushed his muzzle against the door lever. It clicked open. The warm desert air rolled in thick with morning heat and the scent of motor oil from the nearby gas station. For a moment he stood there, nose testing the wind. Then he stepped outside. Tap, step, tap, step. Each paw landed slow, deliberate, tracing invisible paths burned into memory. He passed the rusted fence, the mailbox that hummed when trucks went by, and the corner where the smell of fried tortillas from Rosa Valdez's diner always hung in the air. People in town knew Shadow. Many waved from porches or whispered "Morning Hero," but that day their smiles faded when they saw no one holding his leash. "Where's Miss Briggs?" someone muttered near the bakery. But Shadow moved with purpose, confident like he always did when Ellie was near. No one stopped him. By the time he reached La Paz Avenue, the light had turned red. Traffic hummed a low, restless growl of engines and heat. Shadow stood at the curb, nose high, waiting for the chirp of the crosswalk signal, the one Ellie had trained him to follow. Beep. Beep. Then the tone changed. Chirp. And he took a step forward, head low, tail steady. A little girl across the street looked up from her cereal bowl inside her apartment window. It was Emma Valdez. Her eyes widened. "Mom, that's Shadow. He's alone." Her mother, Rosa, hurried to the window, her face tense the moment she saw him step into the street. "Oh no. Where's Ellie?" 2 blocks away, a patrol car idled at the corner, its AC humming, 2 officers inside finishing their morning coffee. Officer Dean Halpern, 29, broad-shouldered and restless, leaned back with his sunglasses on, tapping a pen against the dashboard. Beside him sat Officer Miguel Torres, 26, quieter, observant eyes following every detail. Dean yawned. "Hey, you see that dog? No leash. Looks lost." Miguel squinted. "He's wearing something. A vest, maybe?" Dean smirked. "Could be one of those fake service animals people slap badges on. Let's clear it before someone complains." He flicked on the cruiser's loudspeaker. The mechanical buzz cut through the air. "Dog in the crosswalk, move along. Get off the road." The amplified voice hit Shadow like thunder. His ears flattened and he froze mid-step. He turned toward the sound, confused, disoriented. The noise bounced off the buildings, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A horn blared, then another. Engines revved impatiently as the light turned green. Shadow backed up, tail-tucked paw scraping hot asphalt. He couldn't smell which direction was safe. The air reeked of exhaust oil and panic. From her window, Emma pressed her palms to the glass. "Mom, he's scared." Rosa grabbed her phone and ran downstairs. By now, several drivers had stopped watching. Dean scowled, stepping out of the cruiser. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "He's blocking traffic." Miguel frowned. "Dean, wait. He's got a patch on that vest." "Let me..." But Dean was already moving into the intersection, hand on his taser. Across the street, Rosa Valdez began live streaming. Her voice trembled with anger. "Don't you dare! That's a service dog. He's blind. Emma stood beside her, clutching her mother's arm, tears streaking her cheeks. Please, he's a good dog. Dean didn't hear them, or didn't want to. He raised his voice. Off the road now. Shadow turned toward the noise, trembling body low. The world had gone sound and heat and confusion. He whined once, a sound small and human, and then the taser cracked. The wires arced in the sunlight, two silver snakes flying across the air. They hit Shadow's flank with a pop. The current surged through his body, stiffening every muscle, forcing him down onto the road. The sound that followed wasn't a bark. It was the kind of sound that made people's hearts stop, a cry pulled from a soul that didn't understand why it was being punished. Cars went silent. A dozen phones lifted, and for a moment even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Dean stepped back, panting. Non-compliant animal neutralized, he muttered into his radio. Miguel stood frozen beside the cruiser. He looked at Shadow, still twitching, smoke curling from the taser prongs, and whispered, Dear God, what did we just do? Rosa ran forward but stopped short, still filming, her voice shaking. He's blind. He's blind. Emma's cry echoed hers, small but piercing. From across the street, a man in a flannel shirt set down his coffee and stood. Marcus Reed had been sitting outside his garage, watching from a distance. The instant he saw the vest, something inside him broke open. That's Luke's dog, he whispered. And then louder, That's a Marine K9. He grabbed his phone thumb, hovering over a contact labeled Only Silverwind Ops. He pressed send. The desert air trembled again, but this time it wasn't from heat. It was from engines. The heat came down like fire that morning, swallowing the town of Sierra Verde in silence. The light from the desert sky was so bright it seemed to erase all color. Cars idled at the intersection of La Paz and Fifth. People shaded their eyes, watching the old German shepherd lying in the middle of the road. Shadow was motionless except for a slow, trembling breath. His fur twitched against the burning pavement. A faint smell of ozone lingered where the taser wires still clung to his side. The town had seen accidents before, but never this. A blind service dog tased in broad daylight by its own protectors. For a moment it felt as if the world had stopped. On the sidewalk, Emma Valdez cried into her mother's hands. Mom, make them stop, please. Rosa held her phone high, still filming, voice shaking between anger and disbelief. He's blind. He's a veteran's dog. Somebody help him. Across the street, Marcus Reed stepped from the shadow of his garage. The sun caught the scar along his jaw, the mark he had carried since Kandahar. He saw the vest on the animal and knew instantly. The patch might have been faded and covered in dust, but it still bore the letters he could never forget, U.S. Marine K9, Shadow. He whispered almost to himself, Luke's dog. Then louder, steady this time. That's a Marine dog. Someone get a medic out here. Officer Dean Halpern turned, sweat dripping down his neck. Sir, stay back. This is a police scene. Marcus kept walking. You don't understand who that is. Dean's jaw tightened. I said step back. The two men locked eyes. One wore a uniform polished and new. The other wore the dust of a war no one talked about. Marcus knelt beside Shadow, ignoring the officer. The dog's body was stiff, but his chest still moved. Marcus pressed two fingers to the fur along his ribs and felt the faint thump of life. He's still breathing, he said quietly. Easy, boy. Stay with me. Dean lifted his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We have a neutralized animal at La Paz and 5th, requesting animal control. Rosa shouted from behind the growing crowd. He's not an animal. That's a Marine's partner. The words hung in the air. People began murmuring. Drivers stepped from their cars. For the first time, Dean Halpern looked uncertain. Miguel Torres, the younger officer, moved closer, his eyes searching the vest. Dean, he said softly. She's right. That's a service patch. Look. Dean glanced down. His voice dropped to a defensive whisper. Could be fake. You see what people do to get their pets into stores. Miguel shook his head. That patch is real. Look at the stitching. That's military issue. Dean's answer was short. Doesn't matter. He was in the road. Miguel looked away, disgusted. Yeah. In the road. Waiting for a command that never came. From somewhere far down the highway, an engine roared. The sound was low at first, like distant thunder rolling over the desert. It grew louder, deeper, until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Marcus raised his head. "That's not animal control," he muttered. A convoy appeared at the horizon, dust rising behind it like a sandstorm. The first Humvee came into view, paint scratched by years of service. It didn't slow for traffic. It cut through the heat waves straight toward the intersection. The crowd backed away as it stopped with a heavy hiss of brakes. The door swung open and Major Gabrielle Monroe stepped out. She wore the fatigue of someone who had seen too many battles and no patience left for politics. Her eyes scanned the scene, once sharp and cold. "Report," she said. No one spoke. She walked closer, boots striking the pavement, and stopped beside Shadow's body. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of command. "Who fired?" Dean straightened. "Ma'am, this is a local matter." The animal was obstructing traffic. She turned her gaze on him. "Who fired?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "I did." Monroe crouched beside Shadow, running a gloved hand along the vest. Her fingers stopped at a patch worn almost smooth by years of service. She brushed the dust away, revealing the faint outline of Luke Briggs' handwriting still etched inside the fabric. For a second, her voice softened. "Shadow," she murmured. "I remember this one." Then she stood and faced Dean. "That animal saved 9 Marines in Kandahar, and you shot him because you couldn't see past your own reflection." Dean's face went red. "With respect, Major, he was dangerous." "Dangerous," she repeated. "He's blind, officer. The only danger here was ignorance." Miguel Torres spoke quietly. "Major, I tried to stop it." She looked at him, then nodded once. "Then keep your conscience clean, Officer Torres. You're going to need it." More Humvees arrived. Soldiers jumped out, setting up a quick perimeter. A young medic knelt beside Marcus. "Pulse?" he asked. "Faint, but holding," Marcus replied. The medic opened his bag, sliding an IV line into place. He worked with the calm precision of someone trained to save life in chaos. The crowd watched in silence, some with hands pressed to their mouths, others recording with trembling phones. Rosa stepped forward. "Please take him to the hospital. He's blind. He won't survive this heat." The major nodded. "He's going with us." Dean muttered under his breath. "You can't just take over a civilian case." Monroe turned slowly, eyes locked on him. "I don't need permission to protect one of my own." Marcus looked up from the ground. "Major," his eyes. "You might want to see this." She leaned closer. The medic shone a small light into Shadow's eyes. For years they had been pale and unresponsive, like frozen glass. But now, under the beam, the pupils flickered just a little, almost imperceptible. The medic frowned. "Did you see that Monroe squinted?" He reacted. Marcus nodded, voice thick. "He hasn't done that since the explosion." The medic whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "Electrical trauma can sometimes reset damaged nerves. It's rare, but it happens." Monroe knelt again, her tone softer now. "You hang on, Shadow. Looks like you still have one more miracle in you." As they lifted the stretcher, the crowd parted. Rosa stopped recording. Emma clutched her hand, tears streaking her face. "Is he going to be okay?" the girl asked. Rosa knelt, brushing hair from her daughter's cheek. "He's got soldiers now, sweetheart. He'll make it." From behind them, Marcus stood beside Major Monroe as the vehicles prepared to move. The heat shimmered around them, bending light into waves. Marcus's voice was low but steady. "I called Silverwind because I knew you'd come. Captain Briggs would have done the same." Monroe gave a faint smile. "Luke Briggs never left a man behind. Neither do I." She climbed into the Humvee and shouted, "Move out!" The engines roared back to life. Dust rose again, swirling through the sunlight. The convoy rolled north toward City General Hospital, leaving behind the stunned silence of a town that had just watched honor fall to the pavement and hope rise again. Miguel Torres removed his cap as the last vehicle disappeared. He turned to Dean. "What did we just do, man?" Dean stared at the empty road, his voice barely a whisper. "I think we shot the wrong side." Marcus watched the convoy fade into the horizon. His throat tightened as he whispered the words he'd once heard from Captain Briggs years ago in a burned-out village overseas. "Sometimes it takes the darkest moment to make people finally see." He looked down at the pavement where Shadow's blood had dried in the heat, then at the people gathering their breath again, eyes full of shame and wonder. The town of Sierra Verde would never be the same after that day. Neither would Marcus. He glanced toward the sun blazing mercilessly over the desert road and whispered a promise. "Hold on, old friend. You've still got light left in you." Then he turned and followed the sound of the engines, the wind lifting the dust behind him like a trail back toward redemption. The engines thundered through the desert, a low growl that swallowed every sound along Highway 14. Dust rolled behind the convoy like smoke from an invisible fire. Inside the lead Humvee, the air smelled of metal sweat and adrenaline. Major Gabrielle Monroe sat in the front seat, helmet on her lap, eyes locked on the road ahead. She hadn't spoken since they left Sierra Verde. The only sound was the rumble of the tires and the rhythmic beeping of the medical monitor hooked to Shadow's stretcher in the back. Beside the dog sat Sergeant Danny Reyes, the young combat medic who had served under Monroe in the 13th Tactical Response Unit. She kept her eyes on the monitor, counting every heartbeat, whispering softly to the dog. "Stay with me, Shadow. You've been through worse. You can make it." The IV bag swayed gently with every bump in the road. Shadow's chest rose and fell uneven but steady. His fur was damp with sweat and saline, his breathing shallow but stubborn. Every few minutes his paw twitched as if remembering a command from a long time ago. In the second Humvee, Marcus Reed sat with his hands clasped, the same dog tag he'd carried for years pressed between his palms. He whispered quietly, almost praying, "You saved me once, buddy. I owe you one more chance." The radio crackled to life. A stern voice came through the static. "Silverwind Base to Convoy Alpha. Status on the K9 asset." Monroe picked up the handset. "Stable for now, but critical. ETA to City General 15 minutes. "Understood," the voice replied. "Command is notifying General Monroe. She's en route from the base." The driver glanced back. "General Monroe." "As in your mother." Major Monroe didn't look up. "She doesn't make social calls," she said. "If she's coming, it's serious." Then she looked out the window again, eyes scanning the endless horizon of sand and light. "I've seen men come back from worse," she murmured, "but I've never seen a city wake up this fast." The convoy hit a rough patch of desert highway. The vehicles jolted, rattling every metal plate and piece of armor. Danny steadied the IV stand with one hand and wiped sweat from her brow with the other. Shadow's body tensed again, a small whimper escaping his throat. His eyes, still cloudy and pale, flickered faintly in the harsh sunlight that filtered through the back window. Danny leaned closer. "That's it, boy. You see it, don't you? Just a little light." Marcus, sitting across from her, heard the words and looked up. "He's reacting again." Danny nodded. "Pupil constriction. It's weak, but it's there. The current must have reconnected something." Marcus gave a faint smile, a mix of disbelief and hope. "Guess God found a strange way to bring back the light." Danny exhaled, glancing at the old dog. Sometimes healing looks like a storm before it turns to peace. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of Sierra Verde, the news had already spread. Police cruisers, news vans, and civilians crowded outside City General Hospital, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Justice for Shadow and Honor the Heroes." The Humvees stopped at the emergency bay. The sound of engines faded into the echo of camera shutters and murmured prayers. Major Monroe stepped out first. Her boots hit the pavement with purpose. She turned to Marcus and said, "You stay with him. Don't let anyone separate you." Marcus nodded. "You don't have to tell me twice." Inside, the hospital corridors glowed with fluorescent light, too clean, too white. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and cold. Doctors and veterinary specialists rushed to meet them. Dr. Martin Cly, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a calm voice, took one look at Shadow and barked orders. "Let's get him to trauma room 4. IV fluids, cardiac monitor, cooling blanket, move." Marcus tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him at the door. "Sir, we'll update you soon." Major Monroe stepped beside him. "Let them work. He's in the best hands you could ask for." Marcus stared through the small window, watching the flurry of motion inside. "He's more than a dog, Major. You know that." Her eyes softened. "I know, and that's why we're all here." 10 minutes later, the heavy sound of another vehicle pulling in made everyone turn. A black SUV stopped beside the Humvee, and a tall woman stepped out, her posture as sharp as her uniform. General Grace Monroe. Silver hair pulled back tight, jaw set like carved granite metals gleaming against the desert sun. The crowd parted as she entered the hospital. She passed through the hall in silence until she reached her daughter. "Report," she said. Major Monroe stood at attention. Retired Marine K-9 Shadow tased by local police during a pedestrian incident. No aggression displayed. Civilians witnessed and recorded. He's stable, but his condition is critical. The general's expression did not change. "Any local officials present?" "Not yet, ma'am, but they're coming." Grace Monroe nodded once, then looked toward the trauma room window. Through the glass, she saw the pale body of the old shepherd surrounded by wires, tubes, and steady hands. His fur was matted with dust and blood, his vest laid on a nearby table, torn but still bearing the old insignia. She whispered, "You're still on duty, soldier. We're here now." The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Dr. Cly worked. "Pulse stabilizing," he said. "Temperature dropping. Neurological tremors decreasing." Danny adjusted the monitor and leaned close to Shadow's face. "He's responding to light. Pupils showing reflex." Dr. Cly raised a brow. "After all these years, that's extraordinary." Marcus stood by the door, voice low but trembling. He was blind since the blast. Luke said there was no chance. Dr. Cly gave a faint smile. Maybe there wasn't. Until today. Outside, General Monroe and her daughter watched through the glass. Grace folded her arms. "We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure no one ever forgets it." Her daughter nodded. "The city's going to have questions." "Good," the general said. "It's about time they started asking them." An hour later, the quiet of the hallway broke. Two figures approached, flanked by reporters. The first was Mayor Elaine Thatcher, mid-40s, composed but visibly shaken. Beside her walked Police Chief Alan Dresner, an older man with a heavy build and a face carved by decades of duty. Grace Monroe met them halfway. "You're late," she said. The mayor tried to speak. "General, we came as soon as we could." "This is a tragedy." "No," Grace interrupted. "A tragedy is an accident. This was a failure. Of training, of empathy, and of leadership." The chief lowered his gaze. "I've already suspended both officers involved. Internal Affairs is opening an investigation." Grace stepped closer, her voice calm but sharp. "Suspension is a start. But accountability doesn't end there. That dog didn't just serve this country, he saved lives. And today this city nearly killed him." The mayor swallowed. "What can we do to make this right?" Grace looked through the glass window at the faint movement of Shadow's tail under the blanket. "You can start by remembering what right looks like." Inside the trauma room, Dr. Cly adjusted the lighting and looked up suddenly. "Everyone hold on. Look at this." Shadow's eyes moved, following the glow of the pen light. His pupils constricted again, slightly stronger this time. The entire room froze. Danny covered her mouth, whispering, "He's seeing something." Dr. Cly nodded. "Partial optic response. He's perceiving brightness." Marcus stepped closer, voice cracking. "He's got light again." Danny smiled through tears. "Welcome back, soldier." The general stood silent outside the window. For the first time in years, her expression softened. She reached up and adjusted the metal on her chest as if suddenly it meant something again. Beside her, Major Monroe whispered, "You think he knows he's home?" Grace answered quietly, "I think he never left." The desert sun began to fade behind the white walls of City General Hospital, but inside the light was steady, cold, fluorescent, unrelenting. The trauma wing was quiet now, except for the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor in room 4. Every beep was a reminder that the old shepherd still clung to life. Major Gabrielle Monroe stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the team work. Inside, Dr. Martin Cly and Sergeant Danny Reyes checked the IV line and the neural readings. "He's holding steady," the doctor said softly. "Better than I expected, honestly. Most dogs wouldn't survive a shock like that." Danny nodded, her eyes fixed on the faint movement beneath the blanket. "He's a Marine. They don't quit easy." Through the glass, Marcus Reed watched in silence. He hadn't moved in over an hour. His hands were clasped, Head lowered the chain with Captain Luke's dog tag wrapped tightly around his fingers. Every few minutes he whispered the same words under his breath. "Hang in there, buddy. You're not done yet." The doors at the end of the hallway opened with a hiss. Nurses turned voices, lowering instinctively. A woman stepped inside, tall, silver-haired, wrapped in a gray shawl despite the desert heat. Her steps were slow, but certain, her presence quiet yet commanding. It was Eleanor Briggs, widow of Captain Luke Briggs, and the only person who could still call Shadow home. A young hospital aide offered her a wheelchair. She refused it with a gentle shake of her head. "I've walked through worse," she said quietly. General Grace Monroe met her halfway down the hall. For a moment, two women who had lived too long in the shadow of war simply looked at each other. "You must be Mrs. Briggs," Grace said. "Ellie, please," she answered, her voice soft but steady. "I heard what happened. I came as soon as I could." Grace nodded toward the window. "He's alive. Your shadow's tough." Ellie's lips trembled slightly. "He always was." She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the glass, her hand rising to touch the cool surface. Inside, she could see him: tubes, monitors, wires, and that familiar patch of fur above his shoulder. "He looks so small," she whispered. "He was never small before." Dr. Cly stepped out of the room, removing his gloves. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, recognizing her instantly from the file. "He's stable. Still weak, but stable." Ellie nodded, her eyes never leaving the window. "Can I see him?" "Of course," the doctor said gently. "Just be calm. He'll know your voice." As the door opened, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor filled the hallway. Ellie entered slowly, every step heavy with memory. She stopped beside the bed, her hand hovering just above the dog's fur before finally resting on it. Her fingers trembled as she spoke. "Hey there, soldier." Her voice cracked. "It's me. Ellie." For a moment nothing happened. Then Shadow's ear twitched. The faintest movement, but it was enough. Danny's eyes widened. "He heard you." Ellie leaned closer, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "You remember me, don't you? You and Luke. You were the last thing he ever spoke about." She paused, her voice breaking. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should take care of you. But I think it's always been the other way around." Shadow's chest rose deeper, his breathing evening out. The monitor tone steadied. Then slowly he lifted his head. His cloudy eyes turned toward her voice, and for the first time in years he blinked against the light. "Dr. Danny," said softly, "look at his eyes." The room fell still. A small beam of afternoon sunlight slipped through the blinds, falling across Shadow's face. His pupils contracted once, then again. Ellie gasped. "He sees the light." Dr. Cly nodded, astonished. Partial visual response. "This shouldn't be possible." Ellie's tears fell freely now. She cupped his muzzle gently, whispering, "You see me, don't you? Maybe not all of me, but enough." Shadow's tail moved faintly beneath the blanket, a slow thump. Thump. Like a heartbeat coming home. Marcus stepped inside, eyes wide. "I'll be damned. He's really seeing." Ellie turned, smiling through tears. He never needed perfect sight. He always saw more than any of us. Outside the room, the hallway had grown crowded. Reporters, city officials, and police officers waited under the watchful eyes of soldiers. Mayor Elaine Thatcher stood beside Chief Alan Dresner, both wearing the weight of public outrage like a second uniform. General Grace Monroe faced them calmly. "You've seen the footage?" she asked. The mayor nodded. "It's everywhere. The country's watching." "Good," the general said. "Then you know what's at stake." The chief took off his cap. "We failed." The officers didn't recognize the vest. They acted without thought. Grace's gaze hardened. "Then it's time you start thinking. About training. About accountability. About every person or animal that carries a story like his and never gets heard." The mayor looked at her with weary eyes. "We're preparing a public apology and a reform order for all service animal protocols." Grace nodded. "Do it tonight, and make sure it's not just words." Inside the trauma room, Ellie sat by the bed, whispering softly as she stroked Shadow's fur. "You've done enough, old boy. You can rest now." But Shadow Ever the Marine lifted his head one more time. He turned toward the window, toward the bright rectangle of evening sunlight breaking through the blinds. And for a brief second he saw it not clearly, but as a glow, a shape, a promise of warmth. His breath caught, tail thumped once more, and the faintest sound escaped his throat, a soft, grateful sigh. Ellie smiled through her tears. "That's it, my brave one. You found the light again." Marcus, standing near the door, murmured, "So did we." By nightfall, Sierra Verde was no longer silent. Candlelight flickered outside the hospital gates. Veterans stood side by side with families, children holding signs drawn in crayon. He didn't see the road, but he showed us the way. The story had traveled far beyond the desert now, broadcast, social media, talk shows. Across the nation, people watched an image replayed again and again, a blind dog, scarred and broken, lifting his head toward the light. And somewhere deep in the heart of that image, they saw themselves, their failures, their hopes, and their chance to begin again. The next morning, the desert air was still. Outside City General Hospital, candles had melted into pools of wax. Flags fluttered weakly in the early sun, and the smell of coffee and dust hung over the small crowd that refused to leave overnight. Inside, the hallways of the trauma wing glowed with quiet purpose. Reporters whispered near vending machines. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with nurses. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was reverence. In room 4, Shadow slept under a thin blanket, his chest rising in a slow, steady rhythm. Beside him sat Ellie Briggs, a book in her lap, her hand resting gently on his paw. She wasn't reading aloud, just tracing words with her thumb, letting the silence do the talking. When Marcus Reed entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, she looked up with a tired smile. "You didn't have to come so early," she said softly. Marcus handed her the cup. "Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how close we came to losing him." Ellie nodded, her voice a whisper. "I think about that every time I look at him. Maybe we were all blind until yesterday." At 10 a.m., the city council chamber was filled to the brim. The walls that once echoed with formality now carried the weight of guilt and resolve. At the front of the room stood Mayor Elaine Thatcher, Chief Alan Dresner, and General Grace Monroe. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras blinking like restless eyes. Mayor Thatcher began. "Yesterday our city made a mistake, a devastating one. A retired Marine Service dog, Shadow, was injured because those sworn to protect didn't stop to understand." She paused, eyes lowering for a moment. "This city owes him his handler and his memory, a debt we cannot repay. But we can learn. We can change." She turned toward Grace Monroe, who stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was deep, steady, and cut through the silence like a slow drumbeat. "This isn't just about a dog," she said. "This is about every soul that's ever been unseen, every veteran, every service animal, every person who fell through the cracks of ignorance and haste." She held up a document, bold letters across the top read, "The Echo Act. This act will require every police officer, EMT, and public official to receive specialized training in identifying and assisting service animals and disabled veterans. It begins next week. And it will bear the name of the one who reminded us what loyalty looks like. Shadow the Marine K9, who still stands for something greater than himself." The story went national. By afternoon, news anchors across the country spoke the name Shadow. Footage of his recovery played alongside images of veterans standing at attention outside the hospital. Emails flooded the mayor's office. Schools began planning assemblies about empathy and awareness. But in Sierra Verde, the real story was quieter. Marcus and Ellie walked out of the hospital side by side, their steps slow under the warm light. Reporters tried to stop them, but Marcus waved them off. "Let the dog rest," he said gently. "He's done enough talking for all of us." Outside near the hospital courtyard, a group of children from the community center waited. Among them was Emma Valdez, clutching a handmade card covered in blue marker paw prints. She ran to Ellie and held it up. "It says, 'Welcome home, Shadow,'" she said shyly. Ellie knelt down, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. He'll love it." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shadow stirred. His eyes, still cloudy, still fragile, caught the soft glow of a bedside lamp. For the first time since the explosion years ago, he tracked movement, a faint blur of light shifting in the darkness. Danny noticed and gasped softly. "Marcus, Ellie, come here." They rushed to his side. Shadow blinked again, then turned his head slowly toward Ellie's voice. Her hand trembled as she whispered, "You see me." He couldn't see her fully, not yet, but he saw the glow around her, the outline of her warmth. He wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate. Marcus exhaled, voice breaking. "I think he does." Danny smiled, her eyes glistening. Maybe faith is just another kind of vision. The next morning, Chief Dresner came to the hospital alone. No cameras, no press, just a man carrying the weight of failure. He knocked on the door gently before stepping inside. Ellie looked up, wary but calm. Marcus stood beside her. The chief removed his cap. "Ma'am, I wanted to say I'm sorry. There's no excuse. I failed that dog, and I failed you." Ellie studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You failed yourself too." He nodded slowly. "I know, and I intend to make it right. The first Echo Act class will start under my department. I'll be there myself." She looked at him, her voice soft but firm. "Then make sure no one ever has to hear another animal scream in fear because someone didn't take the time to care." He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." Before he left, he turned toward the bed. Shadow lay with his head on his paws, eyes half open. The chief's voice cracked. "Semper Fi, Marine." Shadow's tail moved once, a silent acknowledgement. The room stayed still after he left, filled with something between forgiveness and grace. Weeks passed. The Echo Act went into effect. Every station, every emergency department, every city worker received training led by veterans, dog handlers, and people with disabilities. The first day of training, a massive photo hung on the wall, Shadow in his Marine vest, eyes half closed, head lifted toward the sun. Underneath were the words, "He didn't see the road, but he showed us the way." Children drew murals of him around Sierra Verde, on school walls, library corners, and even bus stops. Tourists stopped by the hospital courtyard to leave small flags and dog biscuits at a memorial plaque. Marcus built a wooden bench beside the mural. He carved the words quietly one afternoon, "For Luke, for Shadow, for the light that came back when we thought it was gone." Ellie joined him there every evening, watching the sky turn gold over the desert. Sometimes Shadow sat at her feet, his head resting against her knee, eyes turned toward the horizon. He could see it now, blurred, imperfect, but enough to chase the light. One afternoon, Ellie said softly, "You know, Marcus, I used to ask God why he took the sight from him, why a dog so loyal had to live in darkness." Marcus looked at her, then down at Shadow, who was dozing in the sun. "Maybe," he said, "he didn't take it. Maybe he saved it for a day when the rest of us needed to see." Ellie smiled, brushing her fingers through Shadow's fur. Then I guess that day finally came. The wind carried their words away across the desert, through the quiet streets of Sierra Verde, a town that would never again look at a service vest or a wounded soldier or a loyal dog the same way. The morning sun rose soft and gold over Sierra Verde, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness. It had been 2 months since that terrible day on La Paz Avenue. The scorch marks were gone from the asphalt, but no one in town forgot what had happened or what came after. Outside the Sierra Verde Public Library, rows of folding chairs filled the square. Veterans in uniform sat beside children in bright shirts, teachers, police officers, and old neighbors who still remembered Captain Luke Briggs' name. In front of them stood a covered bronze statue, a German shepherd head lifted toward the horizon. Behind it, a banner read, "The Echo Memorial Dedication, in honor of service, loyalty, and second chances." The crowd quieted as Mayor Elaine Thatcher stepped to the podium. Her voice was softer now, more human. 2 months ago, she began, our city faced a moment that tested who we are. A mistake born of fear nearly took a life that had already given everything for others. But in that same moment, something greater began an awakening. She paused, glancing toward the front row where Ellie Briggs, Marcus Reed, General Grace Monroe, and Sergeant Danny Reyes sat together. And beside them, lying calmly with his paws crossed, was Shadow. His fur had grown thicker again, his eyes still cloudy but no longer empty. When the light hit them just right, there was a faint shimmer, a reflection of life rediscovered. The mayor stepped aside. Ellie rose from her chair, her shawl brushing against her shoulders like memory itself. When she reached the microphone, the square went utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. "I was married to Captain Luke Briggs," she began, her voice firm but trembling. "He served his country overseas, and when he didn't come home, I brought home the one part of him that still could his dog Shadow." Her eyes drifted down toward him, and she smiled faintly. "For years I thought I was taking care of him. But the truth is, he was taking care of me. And when the world went dark for him, he never stopped trying to walk toward the light." A pause. Then she said quietly, "The day they hurt him, I thought hope was gone. But he proved me wrong again. He found the light, and he helped all of us see what we'd been missing: compassion, patience, and the courage to stop and listen before we act." Her words hung in the air. When she stepped back, no one clapped right away. They just breathed the kind of silence that feels sacred. General Grace Monroe approached the podium next. Her posture was straight, her medals gleaming in the sunlight. "Shadow was trained to serve," she said. "But what he did goes beyond duty. He reminded a city, and maybe a nation, that loyalty doesn't retire. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. And light sometimes finds its way through the most unexpected cracks." She turned to Ellie and Marcus. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, it's my honor to present Shadow with the Medal of Service and the title of Honorary Veteran." A soldier stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. Inside was a medal engraved with the Marine crest and the words, "Semper Fidelis," always faithful. Grace knelt beside Shadow, attaching the medal gently to his vest. The old dog blinked in the light, head tilting slightly toward her touch. When he heard the applause swell through the square, his tail thumped twice on the ground, slow, steady, proud. After the ceremony, a young voice called out. It was Emma Valdez, the little girl who used to read to Shadow at the community center. She held a folded piece of paper in both hands, walking nervously to the microphone. "Can I say something?" she asked. The crowd encouraged her with quiet smiles. Emma cleared her throat. "When I first met Shadow, he couldn't see me, but I felt like he did. He listened when I was scared. And when he got hurt, I wanted to tell him that being brave isn't about not being afraid, it's about still showing up." She looked down at him, smiling through tears. "So thank you, Shadow, for showing up for all of us." The applause that followed wasn't loud or wild. It was tender, the sound of hearts opening. Mayor Thatcher returned to the podium. She nodded to Ellie. Together they pulled the cloth from the statue. Gasps spread through the crowd. The bronze shepherd stood tall, gaze fixed on the horizon, wearing a vest engraved with the Marine insignia. At the base, words were carved deep into the stone. "He didn't see the road, but he showed us the way." Below it, smaller letters read, "Shadow U.S. Marine K9, Hero Survivor Teacher." Ellie reached out her fingertips, brushing the cool bronze. "Looks just like him," she whispered. Marcus smiled softly. "Maybe a little younger." Danny laughed quietly. "Aren't we all in our memories?" That evening the square emptied slowly. The last rays of the sun turned the statue gold, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. Ellie stayed until the sky went violet. Shadow sat beside her, his muzzle resting gently on her lap. In the fading light, he lifted his head toward the horizon, toward the same desert road where his story had nearly ended. For a long moment, he seemed to look straight into the setting sun. Ellie whispered, "You see it, don't you?" The light shadow blinked once, eyes glinting faintly in gold. His tail moved slow and sure. It wasn't perfect sight, but it was enough. Marcus stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, watching. He said quietly, "You know, Ellie, I used to think heroes were the ones who fought wars. Now I think maybe heroes are the ones who heal after them." Ellie nodded, her voice soft and certain. "He's been healing us all along." As the wind rose, it carried the faint sound of flags rustling and bells ringing from the town square. Above the memorial, the bronze shepherd caught the last of the sun, and for one final moment it seemed to glow as if the light inside Shadow had finally found its way home. They say the world doesn't stop for anyone, but sometimes it should. Sometimes it needs to. Because that's when we notice the small, quiet miracles walking beside us. The ones who don't need to see the road to show us where to go. Shadow didn't just survive. He reminded a city and all of us that light never truly dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to find it again.